Boldwood presents The Old Girls' Island Getaway, written by Kate Galley and read by Patricia Gallimore. Prologue.
Dear Dotty, how are you, old girl? It's been a long time. Too long, really. I was thinking only the other day, as I looked out over the water, about our time with Eleni, when you and Philip came to stay. But that was over 10 years ago. Can you believe it's been so long? I thought I'd put pen to paper rather than fingers to keyboard. It's so convenient to send an email to keep in touch with dear friends, but a letter through the post gives a much more personal touch, wouldn't you agree? The truth of the matter is that I've not been too well, and I'm reaching out to you now as one of my, well, let's be honest, remaining friends. There are so few of us left, aren't there? Do you feel as you get closer to meeting your maker that you need to right the wrongs of your past? Do you also have demons taking up too much space in your head? To be completely honest, Dotty, someone is out to discredit me, and I don't deserve it. I'd love your support. I've adored spending my retirement living on this beautiful island, but now, without Eleni, it's not really the same. I don't think I could make the journey back to the UK any longer, but do you think you could manage a long weekend here? Or perhaps a week? I would dearly love your company. You're the only person who can always bring a smile to my face. It really would be wonderful to see you before I shuffle off this mortal coil. Much love to you, Rupert.
Chapter 1. Gina.
The house was in darkness, and the only sound came from the soft tread of her steps on the staircase as she worked her way down into the hallway. The light from the moon cast an eerie glow through the glass on the front door as it appeared from behind a passing cloud, and the letterbox rattled once again. She glanced over her shoulder into the darkness, towards the door, expecting the shape of a person to appear through the glass. But it was only trees she could see silhouetted in the garden beyond. The wind must be picking up, she thought, as she made her way into the kitchen to lock the back door. Then the crunch of gravel underfoot could be heard through the kitchen window, and she dropped the key, which clattered to the floor. It was unmistakable. There was somebody in her garden.
Eric stopped reading and glanced up at me. He widened his eyes for dramatic effect, and I couldn't help but smile.
"Hey, it's supposed to be suspenseful," he said. "Are you not really feeling it? You seem distracted."
The sun was sinking below the line of the trees on the bank of the River Thames opposite, and I watched as the light became fractured through the leaves. Eric was sitting opposite me at the stern of my friend Dorothy's narrowboat, Castillo del Mar, book in one hand, his other gripping a glass of wine. It was our fortnightly book club. We were just waiting for Dorothy to join us. We alternated our meetings between here and Eric's own narrowboat. He was Dorothy's neighbour, and his boat was moored at the end of his garden next door. I'd been attempting to read the same page of my thriller several times, but I just couldn't concentrate on the words. And then when Eric tried to engage me in the plot of his book, I couldn't concentrate on that either. My soon-to-be ex-husband, Douglas, was sitting forefront in my thoughts. He'd appeared earlier that morning, as he did occasionally. He hadn't phoned first, and had given the impression he was passing by, which was ridiculous, as he lived in Oxfordshire, and I was on the doorstep of Hampton Court Palace. "I need you to look over these home insurance documents," he'd said, offering me a sheaf of papers. "You drove for 50 miles into an ultra-low emission zone to hand over something you could have emailed me?" I stated. glancing over his shoulder at his old diesel car. That was going to cost him £12.50 and a ULEZ charge.
"Well,"
he said, looking a little flustered, and I almost felt sorry for him.
"running the house on my own is quite a thing. I just thought you could take a look."
"I'm busy with Dorothy at the moment," I had said. But I did take the papers. I had no intention of reading. "It would be best if you phoned me rather than just turning up."
"It would be best if you answered your phone when I did ring you,"
he said with a hard look, which he quickly softened for effect. I had made my excuses and disappeared back inside Dorothy's house. Even when Douglas did his little boy lost look, he still managed to intimidate me. This spring marked 8 months since he had left me and pushed the sale of our house so that we could go our separate ways. I hadn't been expecting it, and found myself in a position where I had to reevaluate the latter part of my life. I was 71, very nearly 72, and my whole world had been tipped upside down. I'd become companion to Dorothy Reed, an elderly woman who didn't really need much help, but it kept her family off her back to have me close. I'd moved into her beautiful boathouse at the end of her garden, here on the banks of the River Thames in Hampton. I was happy, settled, and beginning to enjoy the autumn of my life. There was just one fly in my soup, though, and it was Douglas. After 2 house sales had fallen through, he decided to move back into our pretty semi-detached in Thame, and was now encouraging me to do the same. He'd told our daughter Alice that he would get me back. This, I felt, sounded rather like a threat. Surely he meant to win me back. But then Douglas was rather used to getting what he wanted. "It was just a blip," our daughter constantly told me. "He made a mistake, but he's home now." She was very close to her father and wanted the family back together again. A few months ago I might have jumped at the chance, but now things had changed. Dorothy had arrived in my life like a burst of sunshine. It was as if she'd thrown open the window of my dusty existence and shown me how to live in a better, brighter way. I didn't want to go home, but it was hard to find the words to break it to my family. My son Chris wasn't a problem, though. He actively encouraged me to stay away. He'd suggested only the other day to move for a divorce. I just wasn't sure if his motivation was solely for my benefit. Chris and his father had never really got on. "I don't seem to be with it this evening," I said now. Eric closed his book and stretched his legs out in front of him.
"No matter. We can just enjoy the peaceful evening," he said.
Eric's mother was Danish, but he grew up in North Wales, the home of his father. Sometimes he sounded quite Welsh, but at other times the soft Scandinavian tones of his accent came through. I was embarrassed to admit it did something to my insides to hear his voice. A little ripple of pleasure ran through me, landing on my lips in a smile. Of course, I would rather have died than tell anybody this, especially Dorothy. I can only imagine the ribbing I'd get. Or worse, the encouragement. He closed his eyes, and I allowed myself to watch him for a moment. This new friend of mine. Eric was just a year or so younger than me, and he had an ex-wife who he got on surprisingly well with. So well, in fact, I wondered why they'd ever separated in the first place. I'd seen her a couple of times when she'd popped in. My balcony in the boathouse had a perfect view out over Eric's garden. I hadn't meant to watch them, but it was hard not to admire their shared respect as they enjoyed a moment together in the sun. The way they laughed together and how relaxed they were in each other's company gave me pause as I considered the frostiness often between myself and Douglas. Eric, his ex-wife, and their grown-up son proved that despite a divorce, it was quite possible to be the perfect family. It was unusual for me to have a male friend. In truth, other than Eric and Dorothy, I didn't have many friends at all now. My own fault, of course. To have a good friend is to be a good friend, and I was really beginning to learn that. I pulled my gaze from him and forced myself to stare at the words on the page again, but they didn't register. Then my phone pinged with a message. Glancing down, I could see it was from Douglas.
"Answer it if you need to,"
Eric said, his eyes still closed. "No, thank you," I said. "I'll phone him later. I really don't want to get into a text chat with him. Anyway, Dorothy should be here in a minute and we can get this book club started." Eric raised his wine and grinned.
"I have well and truly started," he said.
I smiled at him and then closed the book. I would have to sort out the Douglas situation at some point. It wouldn't be resolved on its own, but tonight I would put him to the back of my mind.
"Permission to come aboard?"
Dorothy arrived with her book in one hand and a plate of cake slices in the other. "It's your boat. You don't need permission." I jumped up to help her aboard. Eric ducked down and disappeared through the door inside the boat, returning moments later with a glass which he filled from the bottle by his seat. He pushed the comfortable deck chair forward to Dorothy, and I found myself sitting close beside him on the bench seat. I wasn't unhappy about this arrangement.
"I've been thinking,"
Dorothy said.
"Dangerous,"
said Eric with a chuckle.
"I think this book club deserves a proper name, and I've come up with Reading Between the Wines,"
Dorothy said, which caused both Eric and me to laugh.
"Genius," he said. "It's perfect."
Dorothy handed the plate out, and even though I'd already had a slice of her carrot cake that morning, I couldn't resist a small piece of her flapjack.
"Left over from my coffee morning," she said.
Eric leaned forward and took a slice of lemon drizzle.
"Another coffee morning? How come I'm never invited?"
He said this with a wink.
"Ladies only, I'm afraid. Quite honestly, Eric, you tip the balance and some of those women would have you for breakfast."
Eric snorted and then choked on some cake crumbs.
"I'll have to take your word for it," he said.
In truth, Dorothy's coffee mornings were entirely for charity. She'd invite a selection of local and not-so-local women, present them with one of her ventures, and relieve them of some of their cash. She was careful who she invited. It was all about raising funds for needy causes, and not in any way to make herself the most important person. Quite the opposite. I'd begun to help her by making the cakes, because I certainly didn't have any cash for her. Once Dorothy was settled, Eric raised his glass.
"To the Reading Between the Wines Book Club. May all good things come to us. Health, happiness, adventure, and companionship,"
Eric said, and his gaze lingered on me for a moment.
"And travel,"
said Dorothy. "More travel?" I asked cautiously. The month before, Dorothy and I had been on a cruise on the River Nile with an art appreciation group she'd met on a previous holiday. Mostly I was with her as a companion, but Dorothy wanted to tap into my expertise as a former art historian. Well, that was what she'd told me, but I hadn't been in that role for decades. We'd had a great time, though. The group were a fun bunch, and we visited all the expected sights. The small ship itself had been an experience. Dorothy and I had shared a cabin with a lovely balcony, which had proved to be less lovely when we were moored. What we hadn't been told was that because the river was so popular for these tourist cruises, the ships and boats had to moor side by side away from the riverbank. This meant that if you were unlucky enough to be on the outermost point, you had to walk through as many as 3 or even 4 other ships to get to the land. Dorothy had put a positive spin on it, but after a week of this, I think even her resolve to be upbeat and sociable had weakened. What neither of us had expected was a close company with the occupants of the other balconies either. One afternoon we'd been sitting out enjoying a gin and tonic when we moved alongside another ship, and we were nose to nose with a couple trying to enjoy their evening too, their faces pressed together in a passionate kiss. After a quick greeting, we'd all scuttled back inside our cabins. Dorothy and I had laughed uproariously, and then, remembering the couple were only a few short feet away, dialed it down to sniggering like children. I felt a bit twitchy about talk of more travel. My role as her companion was tenuous at best. I didn't want her family to think I was taking advantage of Dorothy for some free holidays. My friend Rupert has written to ask if I'll go and visit him. I haven't seen him for years, and I really would love to go while I still can. Of course, I need you to come with me, Gina. I'm thinking just after the Easter weekend. How does that sound? It sounded like I'd be packing my bags again in a fortnight's time. If you'd like me to accompany you, Dorothy, then of course I will. And we'd stay with Rupert, would we? Oh, yes. Rupert has plenty of room. Since his wife Eleni died, he's rather been rattling around in that huge place of his. Poor old chap. I knew he wouldn't be too good on his own. He's not been very well and could do with some support, I think. Where does Rupert live? Eric asked the question that was hovering on my own lips. A lot of Dorothy's friends were in London, but some were a little further afield. We'd been as far as Durham to visit an old school friend of hers just after Christmas. Rupert has a beautiful villa near Cassiope, Dorothy said. It's really quite something with spectacular views out to the sea. Cassiope, I said, not immediately able to place the name. Corfu, Eric said, looking a little wistful. Cassiope is on the beautiful island of Corfu. Chapter 2. Florence. Florence tried to calm her mind, but a million thoughts were flying around it and crashing into each other like bumper cars at a funfair. She considered calling her meditation guru, but really she was far too overstimulated, and it would take Nina most of the precious hour to get her to see those waves crashing on that faraway shore. Florence was too upset and more likely to visualize being washed up on the beach with seagulls picking at her. She didn't want to waste Nina's time. She thought about phoning her husband, Hugh, at work, but when she glanced at the calendar on his tablet, she could see he would be in his surgery, discussing potholes with his constituents. Hugh was dedicated to his work and would spend inordinate hours helping his voters. He had been voted the most loved and trusted politician in a recent poll. He'd also been voted the sexiest in another. Florence was considered the luckiest woman in the country. It made her smile to think about that, for myriad reasons. She picked up the script she'd been reading before her brother Lance had phoned her and tried to re-immerse herself in the pages. In 2 months' time, she'd be on a flight to Rome to start filming the epic fantasy movie she'd been cast in. Her agent had been delighted to tell Florence she'd secured her the part of the lead's mother. Florence was 55 and had to accept the reality of this, And yet it was hard to reconcile herself with these older parts, because it felt like only 5 minutes ago she'd have been the young lead herself. Her daughter, Madeline, was always on hand to remind her how old she was. When you had a 30-year-old child, you really had to get over yourself. She threw the pages back on the glass coffee table and sighed theatrically, which was ironic, really. All Florence could think about now was Andreas Dukakis. She'd told Lance on the phone she hadn't thought about Andreas in years, but that wasn't true. She spent quite a lot of time thinking about him, actually. His beautiful, sun-kissed skin, his deep chestnut-coloured eyes, the way his smile involved every muscle in his face. And those strong arms of his. Of course, he'd be her age now, but Florence would put good money on him still being as gorgeous as he had been when he was 18. In the kitchen, she opened the fridge and glanced over her shoulder to her vintage Lepe clock on the wall to see if it was too early for wine. It was 3:55. Florence pulled a bottle of Chateau Minuti out and poured the pink fizz into a crystal flute. When she stayed in their London home, she worked hard to keep up the expected image of the celebrated actress. Her hair was always perfect, her makeup just so, her clothes were designer rather than high-end high street, and there was always the finest wine and gourmet food in the fridge. It was all done, really, in case anyone dropped by, which they often did. In their second home in Kent, Florence dressed down and was more comfortable with a cuppa and a Kit Kat. She'd been acting since she was 15, and it seeped into her entire life. She took her glass of rosé down the steps into the snug and stretched out on the teal velvet sofa. She sighed again, but it was without much conviction this time, as she was exhausted. "But why now?" she'd asked her brother on the phone. "It's been 37 years, for goodness sake."
"Do you wish I hadn't told you?"
Lance had said. "Right now? Yes, I wish you hadn't told me. I was happily ignorant, but now I feel that action is needed."
"This new information does rather change things, but have a think about it. Have a good think about what you want to do. Because once you knock on that door, you can't take it back. You know that, don't you?"
"Yes," she had said. "I do see that." Florence closed her eyes for a moment and pictured Andreas on the beach, his hair wet from the sea, his smile just for her. There was a click as the front door closed, and then footsteps echoed down the polished oak floor of the hallway. Hugh was supposed to be in Kent. "Darling!" he called out to her, and she swung her legs round until her feet found the floor. "What are you doing home?" she said, as she stood to greet him. Hugh Winton was usually so buttoned up, but right now his shirt was undone and his tie was hanging off to the side, as if he'd either been in a fight or had tugged at it himself.
I cut the surgery short,"
he said simply, and sunk down onto the sofa. "Are you not well?" Florence asked him.
"I'm fine. Just tired. Look, Florence, we need to talk."
She placed her glass on the mantelpiece and turned to her husband, her arms folded against whatever was coming.
"I'm having a little bother with that journalist again. He says he's got photos this time."
"Compromising photos?"
"Yes, Florence," he said tetchily. "We weren't playing hopscotch."
"Another casual thing?" Florence watched as Hugh ran his fingers through his hair and then rested his head in his hands.
"No," he said. This is quite different.
He looked up at her then, his face a picture of regret. You finally met the love of your life? She stated.
Yes, I think I have.
Then you know what you need to do, Hugh. You need to get your statement out before any photos are leaked. But you must tell Madeline first. It will be horrible for her to read about it, or worse, to see pictures of you. Nobody needs to see their father like that.
I love you, Florence, he said.
I know, she said.
We'll probably go to Kent.
I know, said Florence again, and then walked out of the room. I'd like to get a flight early next week, Florence said. Hugh has some things to wrap up before he puts a rocket under our marriage, and I have no wish to be here when he does. She was sitting at the dressing table in her bedroom, scrutinizing her face in the mirror, while she talked to her agent, Lucinda, on the phone. I don't want you staying in an hotel. I can book you into an Airbnb, or better still, I know someone on the island. He's a dear old friend of mine, and I know he'd be delighted if you stayed there with him. He has a super place, very private, Lucinda said. Why have you picked Corfu, anyway? Because I want to find someone, said Florence. She pulled open the bottom drawer of her jewellery cabinet, where she kept a few important things, and took a photo from underneath a stack of papers. She gazed at the image of Andreas, the most beautiful man, the love of her life. Okay, Lucinda said slowly. Anything I should know about? I don't want you to do something you'll regret. Regret? Florence pushed the word around inside her mouth, and then reached for her glass of rosé to wash it away. I'm way past worrying about such things. Have you thought about going to stay with Madeline and her husband instead? No, I don't want to descend upon them. They have each other. Madeline will be fine in America. The news will be watered down by the time it reaches them in California. So I'll tell Rupert to expect you, shall I? Lucinda said. Yes, if you think he'd be okay with me staying. I'll be no trouble, Florence said. And Lucinda laughed. Have you actually met you, Florence? She said with some affection in her tone. There's always something. There's always something. Chapter 3. Dorothy. Dorothy had chosen a table by the window so she could watch the comings and goings of the Saturday morning shoppers. It meant that if conversation became difficult, she'd have something to comment on beyond this table and chairs. These 2 cups of tea and the beady eyes of her daughter. Her daughter Sophie was the head of a girls' school in Surrey, and consequentially spoke to everyone as if they were a wayward teenager that needed setting on the right path. Dorothy could only be grateful that Sophie was so busy with work that her attention wasn't firmly on Dorothy. Not much of the time, anyway. Are you eating enough? You look a bit thin, Sophie said now. I could get you a slice of cake to go with your tea. What do you think? I think no, thank you. I had a bacon sandwich for breakfast, you know. I haven't lost any weight at all. I'm just old. Look, Dorothy said, pinching the skin on the back of her hand until it had lifted into a peak. Do you remember doing this years ago? You said we could test the elasticity in our skin to see if it snapped back. They both watched the back of Dorothy's hand until it was clear that peak wasn't going anywhere, and she slapped it down. See? Old, she said, and they shared a smile. Speaking of old, Mum, as it's your 90th later this year, would you like to do something special? I need to get in quick before Lavinia does. Lavinia was Dorothy's daughter-in-law, married to her son Miles, Sophie's brother. She was an absolute delight. They didn't have that cliched mother-in-law, daughter-in-law relationship. They were good friends. Lavinia had a lot of time on her hands and inevitably took on a lot of the family arrangements. Parties, Christmas get-togethers, Mother's Day events, and any shared holidays. Sophie often complained to Dorothy that Lavinia took over everything. In fact, Lavinia had already approached Dorothy about her big birthday. She'd suggested an epic holiday, as she called it. A few days in San Francisco, and a jaunt up in the mountains to Lake Tahoe, or maybe a trip to Oz. She'd also suggested Iceland, the fjords, or an Italian lake. It sounded as if Lavinia would have them on a world cruise if she couldn't be reined in a bit. Dorothy decided not to mention this to Sophie now. "Why don't you talk to Miles and arrange something between you? That would be perfect. I'll take a small surprise," she said diplomatically. In truth, Dorothy didn't really like to think about the fact that she was going to be 90 years old. She'd always been somebody that embraced life and didn't worry about things that were out of her control. But the number was so huge. When she saw it written down, the 9 and the 0 together, it physically shocked her. She'd been on this planet nearly 10 years short of a century. It was almost inconceivable. And then she usually had a word with herself. Perhaps she was too old for an existential crisis. "Luke and I are going away in a couple of weeks' time," Sophie said. "We really felt as if we could do with a break." This was music to Dorothy's ears. She'd been expecting for some time that Sophie might announce a break for her and Luke from each other, permanently. They'd obviously been having a difficult time, and Dorothy had put it down to both Sophie's stressful job and the number of hours she spent at the school, and Luke's busy work schedule at his firm of accountants. They didn't seem to spend nearly enough time together. It was wonderful to hear they were addressing it and getting away. "What are you going to do with Juliet?" Dorothy asked her. Juliet was Sophie and Luke's 14-year-old daughter, and Dorothy's youngest grandchild. She boasted of being almost 15, but in truth her birthday wasn't until the autumn. Dorothy thought it very ironic that Juliet wished to add years to herself, while Dorothy would dream of shaving some off. "She's going to stay with her friend Lyra. Lovely girl. I'm hoping the influence of some good behaviour will rub off on her," Sophie said. "She's spirited, for sure, but she's got a good heart and a good head, too. Shame she doesn't spend more time with it stuck into her studies, then." "Life can't always be about school," Dorothy chided. It bothered her that Sophie sometimes lost sight of the world outside the school gates. She and Juliet constantly butted heads, and Dorothy couldn't help thinking that more than Sophie and Luke's marriage could benefit from time away. "Gina and I are going away too, in fact. We'll be away that same week," she said. And Sophie raised her eyebrows. "Again?" she said. "You've not long been back from Egypt. Where are you off to this time?" "We're going to Corfu to stay with Rupert. Do you remember him?" "Weren't he and his wife jewellers?" Sophie said. "Yes. Rupert and Eleni had the jewellers in Hatton Garden. I took you there once to pick up my engagement ring. They'd sized it up for me. You were like a little magpie with huge eyes for all the jewels. Eleni let you try on some of the rings, if you remember." "Oh, yes. God, I loved that shop. Not that I carried on that love of huge gems into my adulthood," she said, looking down at her own engagement ring. It was a pretty little sapphire with 2 small diamonds on either side. Modest, but really lovely. I'm looking forward to getting away. Luke and I really need this time together.
I know, love, Dorothy said, reaching across the table and taking her daughter's hand. You'll come back refreshed and renewed. Where are you both going?
Rock climbing in Wales, Sophie said. Dorothy had to concentrate really hard on not laughing. It wasn't quite the romantic getaway she'd been imagining, but then, what could be more team-building than hauling each other up a rock face? She was about to make some quip about Sophie making sure to check all of her own equipment in case Luke was using it as a way to get rid of her, but she changed her mind. Sophie was looking serious, and Dorothy wasn't sure how the joke would land.
I think that sounds perfect, she said instead.
And you feel you can manage another trip away? Sophie asked. It's not too much for you, is it? I know you have Gina to look after you, but she's 70-odd herself, isn't she? Can you both cope?
Dorothy laughed and placed her now empty cup back in its saucer. Gina is very fit and able, I'll have you know. And anyway, all we're going to do is sit on an aeroplane and then hang out at Rupert's lovely villa. Not very taxing at all. Nothing too exciting.
You say that, Mum, but you and Gina usually end up in some sort of scrape or another, said Sophie.
And Dorothy laughed again. I don't know what you mean, she said, with an innocent expression on her face.
Just then Sophie's phone buzzed, and she picked it up from the table. Her expression darkened as she read the message.
Oh, damn it, she said.
What is it? Dorothy asked.
It's Juliet, Sophie said, and Dorothy sat forward. Anything to do with her grandchildren, and she was instantly alert, whether to danger or to the pleasure of hearing about something wonderful they had done. Her eldest grandson, Toby, had been married the previous year during a very intense week in which Dorothy had first employed Gina as her companion on a Norfolk country estate. Toby and his wife, Caroline, hadn't been troubled by the goings-on, though. The wedding had been a big success, and now Dorothy only had to hope for a further generation to appear before she disappeared herself, or perhaps she would just have to make way as nature intended. She spent more and more time thinking about her own demise these days, not so much in a way that worried her, but in a quiet sort of resignation.
Is she okay? Dorothy asked. She's fine, but it's her friend Lyra. Her mother has messaged to say she's had an operation she's been waiting for brought forward. They're decamping to her sister's while she recovers, so Juliet won't be able to go and stay with them while we're away after all. Lyra's mother is very apologetic, but it's hardly her fault. Juliet will just have to come with us, Sophie said with a sigh.
I'm sure she'd rather chew her own arm off. No offence, darling, but I don't think that's going to work. She can come and stay with me. She'd like that.
Yes, but you've just said you're going to be in Corfu that same week.
Oh, of course. I could cancel, but I'm not sure I can let Rupert down. He does seem to be nearing the end of his life. I might not get another opportunity, and I'm sure he'll do with the company. What about Miles and Lavinia? She could stay with them.
I think I'd rather chew my own arm off than have that happen, Sophie said wryly.
Well, how about if she comes to Corfu with us? Juliet can make sure I don't do anything too taxing, Dorothy said, her eyebrows raised. She can make sure there's no excitement or fun at all.
That might work, Sophie said, completely missing her mother's sarcastic tone. I'll ask her. She tapped a message to her daughter and then replaced her phone on the table. I don't expect a quick response. I rarely get one. Juliet, on the other hand, asks me a question, and if I don't immediately drop everything to reply, she sends me a series of question marks. Dorothy smiled. She adored Juliet's spirit and her ability to turn a bad situation into something brilliant. She was still a teenager, mind, and could sulk if sulking was required, but she'd drop it quickly enough if an alternative materialized. Sophie's phone beeped with an incoming message, and Dorothy smiled again. Goodness, that was quick. She says she'd love to, in shouty capitals. Looks like it's the three of you off to Corfu then, Mum. Chapter 4. Gina. Juliet's excitement was palpable as we landed at Corfu Airport. It was audible also. We never go anywhere this cool, she said as we navigated the terminal. We left the building and dragged our suitcases out into the sparkling sunshine, where people were queuing for taxis and coaches. It was warm, but not overly so, and I was glad. A temperate 18 degrees was perfect for me. Dorothy enjoyed the heat, but I preferred a bit of cloud cover and a cardigan. It's not as if you never go on holiday, Dorothy said. Yeah, but it's always soggy Cornwall or trekking in the lakes. Not a lot of sexy sunshine in the UK. Little hope of a holiday romance. I glanced at Dorothy, wondering if she could handle a week of her granddaughter, but I was pleased to see she was smiling. You did a French exchange with the school last year, didn't you? She lived in the arse end of nowhere and she was gormless. Dorothy sighed then, and I changed the subject. Your granny says that Rupert lives near the beach. Are you looking forward to swimming and sunbathing? A bit, yeah. But I brought my camera, and I really want to explore, take a few photos, maybe paint. Juliet was looking to walk in her grandmother's footsteps. Dorothy had been a ceramicist, and then had turned her artistic skills to working with kiln-formed glass. Juliet was moving towards her GCSE in art, with plans for sixth form A-levels, and then uni at Central St. Martin's. I'd seen her work. She had a clever technique of taking the photograph and blending the edges out into the canvas with paint. At first you couldn't see where the photo ended and the painting began, but then bit by bit it became more abstract. I was very impressed with her skill, but I knew her mother was keen to push her in a more academic direction. Dorothy actively encouraged quite the opposite. Rupert is sending a car for us, Dorothy said. We're to wait by the arrivals, door A, apparently. We'd come through a completely different door, but it was only a short walk to where we needed to be. We propped our suitcases up against the bollards and waited. It wasn't for long, as I noticed a convertible car had pulled up next to us, and a man climbed out of the driver's seat. He was wearing a white shirt, open to expose the top of his tanned chest. His hair was dark with flecks of grey, and perhaps he wore it a little long for a man who looked to be in his 60s. And then I wondered why I was judging. Dorothy Reed? He asked, leaning forward against the side of the car. Yes, that's me, and this is Gina Knight, and my granddaughter, Juliet, Dorothy said, before turning her head slightly in my direction to whisper, Step aside, Shirley Valentine. I suppressed a chuckle as the man walked towards us with his hand outstretched. Calimera, he said in greeting. I'm Rupert's friend, Yanis. Dorothy shook his hand. Then he placed it in mine before doing the same to a delighted Juliet. Calimera, Juliet parroted back to him. It means good morning. I've been practicing on my Google Translate app.
I'm impressed,
Yanis said.
Rupert has sent me to pick you all up. He's very keen to see you as soon as possible.
How is dear Rupert? Dorothy asked.
Rupert is... he's very good, Yanis said. I mean, he gets a little confused at times, and of course, because of his heart, he gets tired too, but he's... Kala, he's okay. He's in a good place for now.
Dorothy had told me Rupert was in his 90s, with a heart condition, and apparently becoming very frail. But you know, he is very elderly, she had said. And all I could think about was that Dorothy herself was 89 and fast approaching 90. I couldn't bear the thought of losing her. Do you know where I can buy a canvas or two on the island? Juliet asked. I plan to paint while I'm here, but I couldn't fit any in my luggage. I'm a bit short on some paint colours too.
Ah, you are a calitechnist, an artist. You have picked a beautiful spot to practice your skills. I do know a place in town. Let me get you settled at the villa, and I can either pick them up for you or can drop you off at the store so you can choose your own. Does that sound okay?
Lampros, she said, looking at her phone. That's splendid. Yanis began to collect our bags and pile them into the boot with a smile on his lips. He was attractive with a nice Mediterranean tan, nothing like Douglas at all. It wasn't that I was actively looking at all men and comparing them to my husband, but actually, that was exactly what I was doing. I was trying to define what it was that Douglas was lacking, and I just worked it out. He rarely smiled. That's all it was. It wasn't about a tan or an accent or a full head of hair or a particular physique. It was about the fact that Douglas was a bit of a misery. He almost never laughed. Perhaps that was my fault. Nice wheels, Juliet said, and she wasn't wrong. His car was a sleek, silver Mercedes convertible.
Thank you, Juliet.
He helped Dorothy into the front seat, and Juliet and I slipped into the back. He held my gaze for a moment as he closed my door for me, and I smiled before looking down at my hands on my lap. Oh, my goodness. Yanis regaled us with information about his beautiful island, as he called it. How he'd been Rupert's right-hand man for the last 5 years, about where the best restaurants, beaches, tourist spots and shops were. He headed north out of Corfu town, and the wind whipped up both mine and Juliet's hair. We grinned at each other and gave up trying to keep it tucked behind our ears. I looked out across the sea towards a lush-looking island, and then further into the hazy distance to what Yanis told us was the Greek mainland to the right and Albania to the left. The water sparkled in the sunlight, and the little island looked inviting. What is that island? I asked. It looks very peaceful.
It has history, he said, glancing at me in his mirror. Il Lazzarotto, a Lazzarotto island.
Oh, a quarantine station, I said.
Yes, he agreed. A monastery in the 16th century, then a leper colony, and later, during the Second World War, the Italian occupation authorities established a concentration camp.
That's a horrible history, Juliet said.
It's not